I found out my dad died 3 days after they buried him. No call, no text, no obituary sent my way. Just silence, until a neighbor whispered, "Your stepmom told everyone you didn't want to come." But I called him every Sunday. I sent him birthday cards, even when he forgot mine. And in the end, I wasn't even allowed to say goodbye. I didn't cry that night. I didn't scream. I just stared at my phone, shaking, knowing she had erased me from his final goodbye. But she wasn't done yet. If you've ever been cut out of a moment that mattered, if someone tried to erase your place in your own family's story, then you know this pain. Stay with me. Because what she took from me, I was about to take back, one truth at a time. My name is Rachel Bennett, and for most of my adult life, I was my father's only child, and his only emotional anchor. Growing up, my relationship with Dad wasn't picture perfect, but it was steady. He made time for my science fairs and band concerts, always with a coffee in one hand and a corny dad joke in the other. My mom passed away when I was 10, and after that, it was just the two of us, until Elaine came into the picture. I was 12 when he met her. She was elegant, confident, and knew how to charm a room, especially one filled with grieving, vulnerable men. Within 6 months, she moved in. Within a year, they were married. Just like that, our little home of 2 became a tense house of 3. Elaine never yelled, never cursed. She didn't need to. Her weapons were subtler: sharp smiles, cool silences, and endless passive-aggressive remarks. If I left a dish in the sink, she'd sigh dramatically and wash it like she was scrubbing away my existence. If I got an A-, she'd say, "I'm sure your father is still proud, even if I wouldn't be." Dad noticed, sometimes. But Elaine was strategic. When he was around, she played the part of the supportive stepmom. "Rachel's got such a strong mind," she'd say with a smile that never reached her eyes. A little stubborn, but what teenager isn't? By high school, I was counting the days until college, until I could leave that house and breathe freely. I moved across the country for school, then stayed on the West Coast to work in nonprofit consulting. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. My space, my freedom. Still, I never forgot about Dad. Every Sunday, like clockwork, I called him. We'd talk about everything: his garden, my clients, old movies we both loved. Elaine rarely joined the calls, and honestly, I preferred it that way. As the years passed, I noticed his voice growing weaker. He'd forget things mid-sentence. One week he told me about a new bird feeder he'd built, and the next, he couldn't remember mentioning it. I asked him to see a doctor, but he brushed it off. "Just getting old, sweetheart." Then, about 8 months ago, the calls became less frequent. Not from me, but from him. I'd call, and he wouldn't answer. No callbacks, no texts. Elaine would sometimes pick up, saying he was napping or tired. She'd always promised to have him call me back, but he rarely did. I sent a birthday gift last spring, a first-edition copy of his favorite Hemingway novel, and never heard a word back. Not even a thank you card. It stung, but I chalked it up to his health declining. What I didn't know was how far Elaine had already gone to cut me out. The last time I saw Dad in person was 2 years ago. He looked thinner, but his eyes still lit up when he saw me. We spent a quiet weekend together, tea on the porch, watching squirrels in the yard. Before I left, he hugged me tighter than usual and whispered, "Don't let people decide what you're worth, Rach." I didn't know that would be the last time I'd ever hear his voice. I don't know how I expected to find out. A voicemail, maybe? A missed call? A message from some distant cousin? But what I got was a text from a neighbor, a woman named Gloria, who still walked her dog past my childhood home every morning. "Rachel, I'm so sorry about your dad. I was surprised not to see you at the funeral." I stared at the message, reading it over and over again, my brain refusing to process it. "Funeral?" I called her immediately. She answered in a whisper, as if she wasn't supposed to talk to me. "Gloria," I said, heart racing. "What funeral?" There was a long pause. "Elaine didn't call you?" she finally asked. "No, I didn't even know he passed. When was it?" Another pause. "3 days ago, sweetheart. The service was Sunday morning. Closed casket. Very quiet. Just a few people from church and some friends. Elaine said you didn't want to come." My mouth went dry. "She said what?" "That's what she told everyone," Gloria said gently. "That you and your father hadn't spoken in years. That it would have been uncomfortable for you." I couldn't respond. My throat was thick with something between rage and disbelief. My hands started trembling. I didn't get a goodbye. I didn't get the chance to stand over his casket and say thank you, or I'm sorry, or I love you. Nothing. Elaine had stolen even that from me. I hung up and sat frozen on my couch. The air felt heavy, like the walls were pressing in. I opened my phone and scrolled through my call history, looking for the last conversation with Dad. It was there, 2 months ago. He'd told me he was tired but doing fine. We'd laughed about a squirrel stealing his tomatoes. And then, nothing. I called his number again, even though I knew he wouldn't answer. It rang twice and went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. What was the point? I wanted to scream, but the tears never came. Instead, I went cold, numb. I sat still for nearly an hour before opening my laptop and searching for his obituary. There it was. A 2-paragraph announcement in the local paper. No mention of me, no surviving daughter listed. Just Elaine, described as his loving and devoted wife. It felt like a second death. Not only had I lost him, I'd been erased from his memory, from his life story. And then came the final blow. The next day, I received a letter in the mail. It was from a legal office, one I didn't recognize. Inside was a formal notice stating that, per the most recent amendment to Thomas Bennett's will, there would be no estate inheritance or property distribution involving his daughter, Rachel Bennett. His daughter. Me. I read the line 5 times. The wording was sterile, cold. No estate inheritance or property distribution involving... Like I was some distant stranger. I didn't care about money. I never had. But this was more than legal paperwork. It was erasure. Elaine had reached into the very document that tied me to my father's legacy and ripped me out. And something in me shifted. This wasn't just grief anymore. This was betrayal. I couldn't stop thinking about that weekend 2 years ago. The last time I saw him. We'd sat on the porch, and he'd told me he was proud of me. That he wanted me to have the old Hamilton watch, passed down from his grandfather. He said, "You keep that one. Elaine has no use for it. That's yours." I still had that moment, that memory. No matter what she tried to erase, he never would have disowned me. Not willingly. Which meant, she'd done something, and I wasn't going to let it stand. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a spiral notebook, listing everything I knew. Dad's will was changed. The lawyer's office wasn't the one he usually worked with. Elaine had told people I was estranged from him. I hadn't been informed of his death until it was over. The Hamilton watch was missing. I underlined the last item. If she forged his signature, if she manipulated his email, if she sent out a new will pretending it was from him, there had to be a way to prove it. This wasn't just grief anymore. It was a mission. A fire under my ribs I hadn't felt since I was a kid standing up to Elaine in our kitchen. She had taken his body, his memory, his voice. But I still had my mind, and I was going to use it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by remnants of a life that had been rewritten without my consent. My mother's jewelry box sat untouched on the dresser. Except now, I wondered if any of it was really hers, or if Janet had picked it over like a vulture long before the funeral. The next morning, I made strong coffee and stared at the living room photo wall. Every picture of me had been pushed to the edges. Center stage, Janet's family, her husband, her kids, their birthdays, their graduations. She had turned my mother's home into a shrine for herself and quietly shoved me into the margins. I didn't need to ask why. I knew what this was. She wanted the house, the land, the bank accounts, the antiques, everything. She had tasted control, and now she wanted to rewrite our family legacy with her name on every page. But there was one thing she didn't count on: me. She thought I was soft, quiet, the nice niece, the one who never fought back. But grief is a strange kind of fire. It either burns you to ash or it sharpens you into steel. And I was done burning. I started by pulling out the old cedar chest at the foot of Mom's bed. Inside were documents, records, letters, some going back decades. My mother had been meticulous. Birth certificates, loan agreements, hospital bills, and legal documents, including her original will. The first version. The one that clearly named me as the sole inheritor. No amendments, no vague addendums scribbled on cheap copy paper. This version was notarized, signed, and very, very legal. I made 3 certified copies and tucked the original into a waterproof folder, which I placed in a locked drawer in my hotel room 20 minutes away. I wasn't going to make the rookie mistake of keeping everything in one place. Then I made a list. Every bank account my mother had ever opened, every property tax payment she made, and every lawyer she'd corresponded with in the last 10 years. I called 2 of her old friends, her pastor and her accountant. The pastor cried on the phone and said, "Your mom told me she didn't trust Janet near the end. She said you were the only one who ever cared about what really mattered." I swallowed a lump in my throat. That confirmation wasn't just comforting, it was evidence. Next, I filed a formal request with the county to obtain the transfer of property records from the last 12 months. Sure enough, Janet had filed a quitclaim deed 2 weeks before the funeral, attempting to move the title of the house solely to herself. I wasn't just dealing with greed. This was fraud. But the real turning point came when I remembered something odd about the funeral. Janet had rushed the service. She claimed it was because the family needed closure. But the cremation happened in less than 24 hours. Too fast. Too clean. My mother had always told me she wanted a traditional burial next to my father. I remembered her exact words. "Put me next to the man who made me laugh even when life broke my back." And Janet had ignored that. Why? I contacted the funeral home directly. After a lot of pressure, and reminding them I was the legal daughter, they admitted something chilling. Janet had changed the instructions 2 hours after my mother passed. She forged my name on the release form. I hung up the phone and stared out the window, rage pulsing through every inch of me. It was no longer just about money. This was identity theft, legacy theft, emotional theft. And I was going to make sure everyone saw it. Not with fists, not with screaming, with facts. I booked a meeting with an estate attorney, one who specialized in contested wills and elder abuse cases. I handed her the original will, my copies, and the forged documents Janet had used to manipulate the system. She leafed through the files and looked up at me. "Your aunt's in deep," she said. "But if you want to do this, we go all in. Public court filings, discovery, depositions, and it's going to get ugly." I didn't flinch. "I'm not here to keep things polite. I'm here to make things right." The attorney smiled. "Then let's start with a cease and desist, and file a temporary hold on all property transfers. If she tries to touch anything, she'll be in contempt of court." I walked out of that office into the blazing afternoon sun with one clear thought in my mind. She took my mother's voice away. But now I was going to use mine, louder than she ever expected. The first crack in Aunt Marlene's polished facade came sooner than I expected. 2 weeks after I started slipping into my mother's old contacts and reconnecting with family members Aunt Marlene had conveniently lost touch with, I received a call from my cousin Leah. Her voice was trembling. "Did you hear what happened at the cemetery?" she asked. Apparently, someone had vandalized our family headstones, my grandmother's and grandfather's. The plaques had been removed and replaced with cheap plastic nameplates that read, "Donor Unknown." Leah was furious. I thought maybe it was a sick joke, but then I remembered Marlene handles the upkeep contracts. It was subtle, but it was her way of burying anything that connected us to the legacy she didn't want us to claim. I didn't call her out. Not yet. I thanked Leah and took notes. Everything went into the file. The next step was money. I needed to trace where my mother's assets had gone. I knew Aunt Marlene was smart. She wouldn't just deposit everything in her own name. So I followed the paper trail backward. I checked property records, shell corporations, and obscure investment accounts under family trusts. With the help of a financial advisor friend of mine, discreet and discreetly angry, I found a chain. A real estate trust called Cedar and Rise Holdings LLC, formed the month after my mother's diagnosis, had acquired several properties in her name, then transferred ownership after her death to Marlene's husband. A quiet shuffle, masked behind legal walls. This wasn't just betrayal. It was premeditated theft. But the real gift came when I requested my mother's medical records. In them was a single chilling note. Patient has cognitive lapses. Recommend secondary guardian or oversight. Dated just a month before she was guided to rewrite her will. The doctor had flagged her mental state. Marlene knew and still pushed. It gave me legal leverage. Not a smoking gun, but a way in. I filed a motion with the county clerk to request a formal audit of my mother's estate. Quietly, through my lawyer. Nothing public. Yet. But the pressure started mounting. Aunt Marlene must have caught wind. She called me that weekend, first time in years. Her voice was syrupy sweet. "Oh, sweetheart, I hear you've been looking into things. That must be confusing for you, dealing with all those numbers and dates." I didn't rise to it. I let her talk. Then she said it, what I'd been waiting for. "You know, your mother wasn't well. She wanted me to take care of things. That's what she said in the hospital. You were too young to understand." I didn't respond. I recorded it. The next few days, I kept going. I reached out to the lawyer who had witnessed the revised will. Turns out, he was retired and suffering from early-stage dementia himself. His assistant, however, was crystal clear. He hadn't taken new clients in over a year, but Marlene came in crying one day, saying it was a family emergency. He probably just wanted to help. More notes, more pieces of the puzzle. And then, the real hammer. I went to the county archives and requested the security footage from the notary's office on the day the new will was signed. I didn't expect much, but luck, or karma, was on my side. There was a video. In it, my mother looked dazed, disoriented. She barely spoke. Marlene was beside her, guiding her hand, literally holding the pen, smiling to the clerk like everything was fine. I watched that video 3 times. My hands shook. This wasn't just moral wrong, it was criminal coercion. I forwarded it to my attorney. Then I called a reporter. Not for a full exposé, yet. Just a tip, a whisper, a warning shot. Within 48 hours, Aunt Marlene called again. This time her voice cracked. "What do you want, Emily? What are you trying to do?" I paused. "I just want the truth, Marlene. And I want you to say it publicly." There was silence. Then for the first time in her life, she hung up on me. That night, I drove by the cemetery again. The nameplates had been changed back. The old brass ones, cleaned and polished, were shining under the moonlight. It was small, but it meant she was rattled. And I wasn't done. When someone builds their life on lies, they never expect the foundation to crack. But crack it did, and I wasn't done. If you've ever felt powerless, only to rise smarter, sharper, stronger, Then you'll want to see what came next. Because the mask was slipping, and I was ready to rip it off. I knew I couldn't just corner Mitchell in a heated moment and expect justice to prevail. No, men like him slither out of panic. They twist facts, deflect blame, turn crocodile tears into shields. If I wanted to truly unmask him, I had to lay a trap so airtight that even his silver tongue couldn't wriggle out. The first step was getting the right audience. So I began stitching together the perfect setting, a quiet family brunch under the guise of celebrating my father's posthumous donation to a local charity. Something that Mitchell would never say no to, especially if there were people around to see him pose as the grieving, generous nephew. I made sure to invite a few extended relatives, some family friends, and most importantly, Alice, my cousin. The only person besides me who had once dared to question Mitchell's integrity. She had moved away years ago, cut off after a financial dispute with Mitchell that was swept under the rug. But I reached out, explained everything I'd uncovered, and what I needed her help with. At first she was hesitant, burned once, reluctant to return. But as I shared the documents, the timeline, the checks forged in Mitchell's name using my father's trust, her silence cracked. "He told everyone I stole from the fund," she whispered, voice trembling. "But it was him, wasn't it?" "It was always him," I said. "We weren't just going to expose his theft, we were going to show the ripple effects of his deceit. The lives derailed, the trust shattered, the legacy ruined. I worked for weeks to get every piece in place. I cross-checked bank records, consulted a lawyer about the trust documents, even had a quiet sit-down with a forensic accountant to validate my claims. I printed it all and placed it into 3 matching leather folders, one for Alice, one for myself, and one to hand to Mitchell when the moment came. Each folder contained a timeline of withdrawals, copies of falsified signatures, and even 2 old voicemails Mitchell had left on my father's landline, careless words that now sounded like confessions. The night before the brunch, I couldn't sleep. I stood in my bedroom, looking at an old photo of Dad and me from a trip to the coast. Before the sickness, before the fights, before the silence. I remembered how he used to rub my back when I was anxious and say, "The truth has its own patience, kiddo, but when it speaks, it roars." Tomorrow, I would let it roar. I chose a navy dress, simple, calm, commanding, hair pulled back, eyes clear. I wasn't going as the grieving niece or the frightened daughter. I was going as the executor of my father's true legacy. The morning light felt sharp, almost surgical, as I arrived at the small rented venue. Alice stood at the door in a crisp beige suit, folder clutched in her hand, jaw tight. We exchanged a silent nod. No theatrics, just purpose. Guests arrived one by one, laughing, hugging, commenting on the table decor I had barely cared to arrange. Mitchell strutted in last, sunglasses tucked into his collar, that familiar smirk plastered across his face. He didn't know it yet. But today, we weren't here to mourn or to celebrate. We were here to witness the truth and to let it burn. The day of the estate meeting arrived, and Sylvia walked into the law office not as the broken daughter they remembered, but as a woman who had stitched herself back together with truth and fury. Everyone was there. Uncle Frank in his smug tan blazer, his wife Marcia gripping her pearls like they might choke her, Cousin Garrett scrolling through his phone, and old Mr. Denvers, the family lawyer, seated at the far end of the long oak table, folders neatly stacked in front of him. But Sylvia didn't come empty-handed. She carried a black leather briefcase. "Let's begin," Mr. Denvers said, pushing his glasses up his nose. "We're here today to finalize the reading of Eleanor Knight's last will and testament. There have been amendments." Frank leaned forward. "Amendments? That's not possible. I was told everything was set months ago." Denvers nodded calmly. "Yes, you were told that. But Eleanor made a new will, handwritten, signed, dated, and witnessed by 2 of her caregivers. Gasps went around the room. Frank's jaw tightened. Sylvia opened her briefcase and slid out a thick envelope. "Before we read anything, I believe there's something you all should see." She pulled out a USB drive and handed it to Mr. Denvers. "Please." He hesitated, then inserted it into his laptop, turning the screen so everyone could see. It was a video, dated 2 weeks before her mother's death. Eleanor sat up in bed, her voice frail but steady. "To anyone watching this is my real voice, my real wish. If you're hearing this, it means my daughter Sylvia fought like hell to make it so. And you should thank her." Frank barked out, "This is a trick. She was sick." But Eleanor's voice cut through like a scalpel. "Frank, you've always been greedy, and now you're a liar too. You came into my house, threatened me, and tried to take what was never yours. But I saw you, and I wrote everything down. This will, my last will, is the truth. Sylvia is to receive the house, the accounts, everything, because she's the only one who didn't treat me like a wallet." The room was silent. Frank turned red, then pale, then red again. "This isn't legal. That's not—" Mr. Denvers raised a hand. "The will meets all state requirements, and the video confirms intent. It is legally binding." Sylvia didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She looked Frank straight in the eye and said, "You tried to erase me, but you forgot something." He sneered. "What?" "I don't give up, and I never forget the truth." Then, as if summoned by justice itself, 2 sheriff's deputies entered the room. Sylvia calmly handed them a copy of the financial fraud report she'd filed, with supporting evidence, detailing how Frank had siphoned funds from Eleanor's care account for months. Frank's hands trembled as they placed cuffs around his wrists. "You little—" Sylvia stood firm. "You're not above consequences anymore." As they led him away, Marcia cried, Garrett cursed, and the air in the room shifted. For once, it was no longer thick with lies. It was clear, sharp, just like her mother's final words. Sylvia walked out of that office not just with justice, but with her mother's voice echoing behind her, strong and proud. The silence that followed Marcus's breakdown in court was almost deafening. The judge had banged her gavel once, then recessed the hearing to sort through the mess of documents handed over by Nora's lawyer. Every falsified invoice, every email thread between Marcus and shady contractors, every bank transfer from Nora's trust to his secret accounts. Nora sat still, her fingers laced, as the courtroom slowly emptied. Her father stared at the floor, his composure cracked like fine porcelain. He had always been so polished, so in control. Now he looked small. 2 weeks later, the court officially removed Marcus as executor of Nora's mother's estate. Every cent he siphoned had to be repaid with interest. His personal assets, including the house he'd thrown her out of, were seized to cover the damages. Nora was reinstated as the rightful heir and executor. When she returned to the house, her mother's house, it felt like stepping into a memory frozen in time. The living room still smelled faintly of vanilla and lemon oil, the way her mom liked to clean. But the warmth was gone, replaced by cold marble and sterile furniture Marcus had bought during his renovation. Nora walked through the halls slowly, touching the walls, the doorknobs, like she was reacquainting herself with something sacred. She didn't want the house, not anymore. But it needed to be hers again first, so she could choose what happened to it. She called in a few trusted appraisers and restoration experts, asking them to help bring back what her mother had built, not the glossy shell Marcus had tried to replace it with. They recovered original fixtures stored in the attic, unearthed vintage photos and heirlooms Marcus had boxed up and forgotten. Then Nora hosted a private estate sale, not to sell anything, but to invite the community her mom once loved. Neighbors came with casseroles, old photos, even handwritten notes her mother had left on their doorsteps over the years. Some cried. One woman told Nora, "Your mom gave me money when my lights were about to be shut off. She never told anyone. Not even your dad. Nora said nothing, but something inside her finally softened. The last thing she did was stand in the garden. The hydrangeas her mother had planted were barely surviving, but still there. She knelt, gently clipped away the dead stems, and whispered, "I'm sorry it took me so long, but I'm here now." She kept only one item from the entire house, a ceramic jar filled with recipes, written in her mom's careful, loopy script. Then she sold the house. Not to the highest bidder, but to a single mother with 2 daughters and a tear-stained letter about starting over. Nora knocked 10 grand off the price, then walked away with nothing but a single box under her arm. Back at her modest apartment, she put the box on her counter. Then, for the first time in years, she cooked one of her mother's recipes, peach cobbler. It didn't taste quite the same, but it didn't need to, because it was hers now, and that was enough. 3 months had passed since the court ruling. Julia hadn't returned to the old house even once. It stood there, empty and echoing with too many ghosts. Instead, she'd rented a modest cottage about 20 minutes away, surrounded by trees, with soft light streaming through the windows, and no reminders of the chaos that once consumed her life. For the first time in years, she could breathe. The days were simple. She planted a small garden, something her mother had always wanted to do. The smell of fresh soil on her hands reminded her of childhood afternoons in the backyard, back before the secrets, the inheritance, and the betrayal. Julia often sat outside with her coffee, watching the sun rise and listening to the birds, not needing answers anymore. Just peace. She didn't keep in touch with most of the family. Her cousin Kayla sent a few texts, awkwardly dancing around the subject, but Julia responded politely and let the conversation die. Uncle Ray never reached out again. His silence was his own sentence. A man who had played the game and lost, now exiled not by force, but by his own cowardice. But not everyone stayed away. One morning, a soft knock came at her door. Julia opened it to find Henry standing there. No briefcase, no polished suit, just him in jeans and a sweater, holding 2 coffee cups and a hesitant smile. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me," he said. "I do," she replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. They sat on the porch in silence for a while. The air between them wasn't heavy. It was cautious, yes, but open. Henry had testified on her behalf during the trial. He'd handed over emails, voice memos, and all the financial records that had helped unravel Ray's scheme. But more than that, he had done something Julia didn't expect. He apologized. Back then, she hadn't known what to do with his remorse. But now, in this quiet place, away from war zones and accusations, she saw him not as the man who once kept secrets, but as someone who had chosen to stop. "You were brave," she said, staring ahead. "So were you," he replied. They didn't speak of reconciliation or promises, but when he left that morning, he kissed her cheek gently, and Julia didn't flinch. Weeks passed. Julia found herself laughing more, sleeping deeply, eating meals that didn't come from a microwave. She volunteered at a local community center, teaching budgeting classes to young women starting their lives alone. She told them not just how to read a contract, but how to read people and themselves. One of the girls asked her, "Did someone teach you all this?" "No," Julia smiled, "but I learned the hard way." Sometimes at night, she would sit with a box of her mother's belongings, the will, the locket, a faded photograph of the 2 of them on a beach. She didn't cry much anymore. Not because she didn't feel, but because she had made peace with what had been taken and what had been saved. Justice hadn't given her everything she lost, but it had returned her dignity, her voice, her name. And in the stillness of her new life, Julia realized that revenge hadn't destroyed her. It had rebuilt her. In the end, revenge didn't just expose a liar. It restored a daughter's dignity, a mother's strength, and the truth buried by years of manipulation. Diane didn't just fight back. she reclaimed her name and rebuilt something even more powerful: her sense of self. If this story struck a chord with you, tell us why in the comments. We read every single one. And if you believe justice has its own timing, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories of payback and healing. Because on Revenge Echoes, every lie ends with a reckoning. Until next time, stay sharp and stay true.